Nobody bought her. Nobody wanted her. They left her naked and trembling on the snow, while the laughter of the town tore away the last shred of her dignity. But when everything seemed lost, a man marked by loneliness and pain decided to cover her with his coat, without knowing that this act would forever change the fate of them both. Who was this woman, really? Why were armed men looking for her, calling her by another name? And most unsettling of all, what would Gabriel do when he discovered the truth she was hiding? Stay until the end of this story, because each chapter hides a revelation that will leave you breathless, and the last minute will change everything. Subscribe right now, because here we publish every day the best stories full of love, mystery, and emotion. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you like this kind of tale, support us with a like so we can keep bringing you more. The auctioneer's bell rang 3 times in the square, and the expectant murmur turned into an awkward silence. There, on a platform of frozen wood, she stood, Isabella naked. Her pale skin trembled, not only from the cold, but from the shame of feeling dozens of eyes fixed on every corner of her body. There was no cloth to hide her protruding bones, nor the scars left by hunger and fear. The mountain wind whipped her tangled hair against her face, and even so, she could clearly hear the voice of the auctioneer, Señor Valdez, drawing out each word as if he enjoyed the humiliation. A strong young woman of good appearance. Who will make the first offer? A long silence, then laughter. Low, mocking laughter. A man in the crowd spoke loud enough for her to hear. She's not even good enough to be a servant, she's half dead. The laughter spread like ignited gunpowder. Isabella closed her eyes, wishing to disappear. She remembered the moment they had torn her from the hut where she was sleeping, vaguely recalling a face in the shadows, a man with a curved scar on his forearm. And now, there he was, among the crowd. He watched her with the same disdain one gives a sick animal before slaughter. No one, Valdez insisted, feigning incredulity, but with a glint in his eyes that revealed everything was going according to plan. Not even one dollar. Time stretched until it hurt. The cold pierced her bare feet, and the smell of firewood and sweat from those present surrounded her like a heavy fog. That was when it happened. Firm footsteps broke the silence. Through the crowd, a tall figure, wrapped in a dark coat, made his way forward unhurriedly. His boots crunched over the frost. The murmuring died down. The man, with an unkempt beard and somber gaze, stepped onto the platform without asking permission. He removed his coat and gently placed it over Isabella's shoulders, shielding her from the cold and from the stares. "Enough," he said in a deep voice, but low enough to make everyone lean in to listen. Valdez arched an eyebrow, amused. "Gabriel Mendoza." He pronounced the name as if savoring an old memory. "You have no money. This is an auction, not charity." Gabriel held his gaze. He took a step closer to him and, in a tone barely audible to the rest, whispered something that made the old man smile with a twisted gesture, like one who receives a reminder of an outstanding debt. Isabella, wrapped in the coat, only managed to catch the last word. "Agreement." "Take her," Valdez said, turning to the crowd with a false show of generosity. "Seems no one else wants her." Gabriel didn't wait. He took her by the arm, though not roughly, and guided her down from the platform. The crowd parted as they passed, some murmuring, others watching with a mix of curiosity and disdain. The man with the scar on his arm followed them with his eyes, his lips moving in a whisper that Isabella couldn't make out, but that sent a chill through her blood. When they reached the edge of the square, Gabriel stopped. The wind hit harder there, lifting swirls of icy dust. He looked at her, and for an instant Isabella thought she saw something beyond hardness in those grey eyes, something like recognition. "Walk," he ordered, turning toward the road that led into the hills. Barefoot and weak, Isabella stumbled over the frozen ground, but Gabriel did not slow his pace. With each step the square faded farther behind, but in her mind the laughter and the sound of the bell still echoed. The coat smelled of smoke and old leather, and that scent began to stir in her a contradictory feeling. Fear, and a strange, faint spark of safety. When they reached the edge of the village, Gabriel stopped again. He pulled a pistol from his pocket and checked it calmly. Isabella instinctively took a step back. He looked at her coldly. "If you try to run now, you won't last a single night out there." His voice was a blade. "And he glanced back toward the village, "they will come for you." She swallowed hard, searching for words. Why did you take me from there?" Gabriel took his time answering. He put the pistol away, adjusted the coat over her shoulders, and murmured, "Because I know who put you there." The air seemed to stick in Isabella's lungs. She wanted to ask more, but he had already turned, starting up a narrow path that led into the mountains. The sun was slipping behind the clouds, and with it went what little warmth the day had left. The trail grew steeper and quieter, broken only by the crunch of Gabriel's boots and the scraping of her feet against the hard ground. In the distance, a crow cawed and rose toward the forest, as if announcing the arrival of something inevitable. Isabella hugged herself beneath the coat. The cold was merciless, but even more so was the uncertainty. If this man knew who had condemned her to that humiliation, why wouldn't he say? And what kind of deal did he have with Valdez that allowed him to take her without paying a single coin? When the path narrowed until they could walk only single file, Gabriel turned toward her, and for the first time he smiled. But it wasn't a kind smile. It carried both weariness and warning. "I'll tell you something, Isabella." He spoke her name as if he had known it long before. "Sometimes it's better not to know the whole truth." They kept climbing, and the fog began to close in around them. Far ahead, between the trees, something glinted, a metallic flash. Gabriel saw it too. He stopped abruptly, his hand instinctively going to the pistol. "Keep walking," he whispered, though his gaze stayed fixed on that glint. Isabella swallowed hard. The air smelled of smoke, and it wasn't coming from the coat. The fog thickened, wrapping the trail in a damp curtain. Isabella quickened her pace behind Gabriel, trying not to lose sight of him. Whenever the wind tore a gap in the mist, that metallic glint would appear and vanish again, as if someone were watching them from a distance. Gabriel said nothing, but his shoulders tensed. The trail curved toward a narrow, steep ravine. Gabriel's boots sank into the wet earth. Isabella's bare feet grew muddy and cold. For a moment, she thought he could take her anywhere, and no one would ever know. The thought sliced through her like an icy shiver. "Not much farther," he finally said, breaking the silence. The climb ended on a flat stretch surrounded by tall pines. Out of the shadows emerged a dark wooden house, sturdy but weathered by many winters. A thin line of smoke rose from the chimney and disappeared into the fog. There was no fence, no animals in sight. Everything seemed still, almost too still. Gabriel opened the door without looking back. Inside, the flickering light of a pair of oil lamps lit the space. The smell of burning wood mingled with something else, dried lavender. Isabella stepped in slowly, and the creak of the floor under her feet sounded as though she were stepping into a forbidden sanctuary. In the main room, hanging against one wall, was a dress carefully brushed and free of a speck of dust. It was a deep blue, with fine embroidery at the collar. On a nearby shelf, an open book lay as if someone had left it mid-reading only moments ago, and atop a dresser sat a small silver locket. Isabella didn't dare touch anything, but her eyes stopped on the locket. Inside, barely visible through the glass, was a lock of light brown hair. "Don't touch that," Gabriel's voice startled her. He shut the door with a sharp thud. "It's from someone who's no longer here." She nodded, but the image of the dress and the locket stayed fixed in her mind. There was something in the air that didn't belong to the present, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for time to turn back. Gabriel set his coat over a chair and went to the fireplace to stoke the fire. "There's water in the bucket. Wash your feet before you dirty the place," he said without looking at her. Isabella obeyed in silence. The water was cold, but the relief was immediate. As she cleaned herself, she noticed Gabriel taking off his shirt to hang it near the fire. That's when she saw it. A curved scar on his right shoulder, identical to the symbol she had seen on the arm of one of the men who had dragged her to the auction. A half circle with a line through it, burned into the skin like a branding iron. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked away quickly, but the question began to drill into her. How could he have the same mark? Night fell quickly. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters and made the wood groan. Gabriel brought her a bowl of hot soup. Eat. The taste was strong, with herbs she didn't recognize, but the warmth gave her back a bit of strength. Gabriel ate in silence, glancing at her only now and then, as if evaluating her every move. When they finished, he stood and took a thick blanket. "You'll sleep in that room," he said, pointing to a side door. "Don't try to leave tonight." Isabella nodded, but before stepping inside, she gathered the courage to ask, "Why do you have that mark on your shoulder?" Gabriel froze, his hand on the knob of his own room. "Don't ask questions if you don't want answers you won't be able to bear." He closed the door behind him, leaving Isabella alone with the crackle of the fire. She entered the small room assigned to her, a simple bed, a table with a jug of water, and on the wall a wooden crucifix. The cold slipped in through the cracks, but the blanket was heavy and warm. She tried to sleep, but the images of the day haunted her. The platform, the laughter, Gabriel's hand on her arm, and that mark on his skin. In light, uneasy dreams, a memory began to take shape. She was running. The ground beneath her feet was mud, and the shouts behind her grew closer. Two men caught up with her. One grabbed her by the hair, the other tied her wrists. In the struggle, her shirt tore, and through the ripped fabric of one of them she saw that same curved scar. Just before a blow to the head plunged her into darkness. She woke up gasping, her heart pounding like a drum. Outside, a sharp thud broke the night. Another. Then, footsteps. Isabella sat up, clutching the blanket. The steps stopped by the window. A shadow stretched long and still across the wall. Gabriel appeared suddenly in the doorway, pistol in hand, his voice low but sharp. "Step away from the window." She obeyed, but her breathing quickened as she heard someone outside dragging something over the snow and murmuring her name. The murmur faded with the wind, as if the voice that had spoken her name had been swallowed by the night. Gabriel stayed by the window a few moments more, pistol ready, scanning the darkness. Then, without a word, he shut the shutters and slid the latch. "Tomorrow we'll see if they left any tracks," he murmured, leaving the room without another word. Isabella spent the rest of the night half awake, starting at every creak of the wood and every gust of air. When morning finally came, the world was covered by a thick layer of snow and the sky threatened more. Gabriel moved quickly, bringing in firewood, checking the chimney, filling water buckets. By mid-morning, a knock at the door interrupted the routine. Gabriel grabbed his rifle before opening. On the threshold stood a woman wrapped in a heavy shawl, her cheeks red from the cold and wearing a sincere smile. "Gabriel, are you going to let me freeze out here?" He grunted something that sounded more like a greeting than a reproach and let her in. "Isabella, this is Marta," he said dryly. "She lives a couple of miles away." Marta approached her warmly. "So you're the girl he rescued," she whispered, as if sharing a secret. "Don't worry, you'll be safe here." The words hung in the air, heavy. Gabriel frowned but didn't contradict her. Marta brought a couple of jars of preserves and a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "The storm's going to be bad," she said, glancing out the window. "Better not go out for a few days." She wasn't exaggerating. By afternoon, the snow was falling in thick swirls, erasing the trail and swallowing the sounds of the forest. Gabriel reinforced the door with a wooden bar and set a bucket of salt by the entrance. "No one goes out," he ordered, as if the matter wasn't up for discussion. The following days settled into a silent routine. Isabella helped keep the fire going, cleaned the table, and occasionally watched him work in silence, splitting wood or checking his gear. There was something in the way he moved, deliberate, never wasting energy, like a man who had learned to survive by counting every motion. At night, the wind battered the house. One evening, as she adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, Gabriel sat across from her, his eyes fixed on her, not with tenderness, but with a measured curiosity. "Where are you really from, Isabella?" She hesitated. Part of her mind screamed not to say anything, to invent something, to bury the truth even deeper. So she took a breath and began to weave her lie. "From a small village, further south. My mother died when I was a child. My stepfather—" She paused, feigning the effort to contain the pain. "Sold me when I was no longer useful for work in the house." Gabriel didn't look away, but something in his expression shifted. "What was the name of that village?" She pretended to think, looking at the fire. "San Geronimo." He nodded slowly, as if making a mental note. But in his eyes there was a shadow. He didn't fully believe her story, though he didn't call her out on it. The storm didn't let up. By the third day, the snow was covering half the windows. Marta hadn't returned, and the silence grew heavier. Isabella began to notice things: a locked door in the hallway, the sound of Gabriel speaking softly to someone when he thought she was asleep, and always that scar on his shoulder, visible when he took off his shirt to dry it by the fire. That night, as they were preparing dinner, a dull thud came from the roof, as if something had fallen onto the piled-up snow. Gabriel stood, grabbed the lamp and went out without his coat. Isabella waited a few seconds before peeking through the window. The blizzard barely let her see, but she caught sight of a tall, still figure beside him, one that disappeared among the pines with the wind. Gabriel came back, his hair and beard dusted with snow. He didn't say a word. He shut the door, leaned the rifle against the wall, and sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Isabella felt the urge to ask who it was, but she didn't. Something told her it wasn't the moment. Still, the silence that settled that night was different, heavier, as if they both knew that when the storm passed, nothing would be the same again. The storm had not eased. The wind still pounded the walls like an invisible sea, and the snow piled halfway up the front door. The fire was the only thing keeping the cold at bay, yet even so, the air inside the cabin felt colder than ever. Gabriel had been quieter than usual for hours. Isabella noticed his movements had slowed, that he was breathing with effort, as if each inhalation cost him. Her suspicion was confirmed when she saw him drop the axe after splitting only one log. He tried to pick it up, but his hands trembled. "Leave it, I can—" she began, but Gabriel straightened, trying to maintain his usual firmness. It didn't last long. Minutes later, while putting away the firewood, his legs gave out and he collapsed into the chair by the fireplace. Isabella rushed to him. "You're burning up," she whispered, touching his forehead. "It's nothing," he replied hoarsely. "Just the cold." But his pale lips and the sweat on his brow said otherwise. Gabriel wasn't a man to complain, and that told Isabella the fever must be high. Without asking, she grabbed a blanket and covered him, pulling the chair closer to the fire. She prepared hot water with the herbs she found in the pantry, guided more by instinct than knowledge. The hours that followed were a fight against the fever. Gabriel shifted restlessly, murmuring fragmented words Isabella could barely understand. At times he frowned as if reliving something painful. Other times his breathing grew so labored she feared he might not make it. In one of those deliriums, his voice became clearer. "Elena, no, don't cross." Isabella froze. The name sounded different from everything else, laden with an emotion she had never heard from him before, fear and tenderness intertwined. "Who is Eleanor?" she asked softly, though she knew she would get no answer. Gabriel turned his head, eyes half open, but he wasn't looking at her. He seemed to be seeing something far away, something that existed only in his memory. "Don't touch her." "No!" His voice cracked, and his hand reached out blindly, as if trying to grasp someone. Without thinking, Isabella took his hand. She held it gently until he calmed down. The heat of his feverish skin reminded her she couldn't leave him alone for long. She changed the cold cloths, gave him sips of water, and stayed by his side, listening to every fragment of words that escaped his lips. With every mention of Elena, an uneasy curiosity grew inside her. That name felt like more than a memory. It was an open wound. And yet, there was something in the tone with which he spoke it that seemed familiar, though she couldn't say why. The fever lasted 2 days. During that time, the storm outside raged, as if the whole world were trapped with them in the same confinement. Isabella slept little, surviving on soup while keeping watch over Gabriel. On the night of the second day, the fire was low and the silence heavy when she heard a creak on the roof. She thought it might be the snow giving way, but then came a faint tapping on the outer wall right by Gabriel's bedroom window. She rose slowly, took the lamp, and went to look. A shadow flitted across the snow, too fast to make out. Her heart lurched. She shut the shutter and hurried back to Gabriel's side. He was restless again, mumbling something about the hill and the deal. Isabella didn't understand, but each word seemed to fit into a puzzle she still couldn't piece together. At dawn on the third day, the fever began to break. Gabriel opened his eyes, tired but clear. "How long?" he tried to ask, but his voice faltered. "2 days. "You haven't moved from this chair," she said, then added cautiously, "You talked in your sleep. Mentioned a woman. Elena." His gaze hardened instantly, as if a wall had gone up between them. "That's none of your business," he replied, looking away. She wanted to say more, but a dull noise outside interrupted the moment. This time it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a horse's gallop drawing nearer through the snow. Gabriel tried to get up, but Isabella stopped him. He shot her a warning look. "Don't open the door," he ordered, "no matter what happens." Firm knocks struck the wood. Then a man's voice, steady, called his name. "Gabriel Mendoza. We need to talk." The pounding on the door came again, harder each time, as if the visitor had no intention of leaving. Still weak, Gabriel forced himself upright. "I said don't open it," he muttered through clenched teeth. Isabella nodded but stayed close, her eyes fixed on the wood that shuddered with every blow. "Mendoza." The voice outside sounded more urgent. "I'm not here to cause trouble, just to talk." Gabriel drew in a breath, took his rifle and walked to the entrance. He didn't open right away. "Say it from there." "This isn't a conversation to shout through a door," the man replied. "Let me in. The cold is killing me." A heavy silence fell over the house. Gabriel turned his head slightly toward Isabella. "Go to the room, lock it from the inside." She hesitated. "Who is it?" "Just do it." Isabella obeyed, but left the door cracked just enough to hear. The sound of the bolt sliding open was clear, followed by the thud of boots stepping onto the wooden floor. Then, low voices, too low to make out the words, though she recognized Gabriel's tone. Rough, the way it got when his patience was wearing thin. A few minutes later, the visitor left. The icy wind slipped in briefly before the door closed again. Gabriel stood motionless by it, staring out at the snow, as if expecting something else to appear. Finally, he locked the bolt again and leaned against the wall. "Who was it?" Isabella asked when he returned. "A messenger from Valdez," he said without looking at her. "He wants me to come down to the village." "For what?" "He didn't say. And even if he had, I'm not going. Not yet." The answer raised more questions than it settled, but Isabella knew pressing him would only make him shut down further. The next day, the storm eased just enough for Gabriel to decide to cut more firewood. Isabella took the chance to sweep the snow from the threshold. That's when she saw them. Footprints. Not Gabriel's and not an animal's. They were deep, heavy, and circled the house in a perfect loop, as if someone had walked around it several times before leaving. The trail led toward the forest, but hadn't completely vanished. "What are you doing out here?" Gabriel's voice startled her. He was coming up with the axe over his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the tracks. "I was just clearing the entrance." He stepped closer to examine them. He crouched, touched the hardened snow, then looked toward the line of pines. "These aren't from last night. There are older prints mixed in. We've been watched for days." A knot formed in Isabella's stomach. "By who?" Gabriel didn't answer. He stood, eyes locked on a distant point, and murmured something barely audible. "Mateo." The afternoon passed under invisible tension. Gabriel checked every window, reinforced the locks, and left the rifle loaded on the table. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was to give short instructions. Keep the lamp lit. Don't open the door. Stay away from the windows after dark. When night fell, the forest was so silent that any creak sounded like thunder. Isabella couldn't help peeking discreetly through a gap in the shutter. At first she saw nothing, until a figure emerged between the trees, still watching the house. Tall, hat pulled low, standing with a relaxed posture that didn't fool her. He was armed. Even at that distance, something in his silhouette felt disturbingly familiar. A moment later, the man turned his head and disappeared into the darkness, as if he knew he was being watched. Isabella shut the shutter with a snap, her heart pounding. "Did you see him?" Gabriel asked from the table. She hesitated before answering. "Yes, he was there." He nodded, as if he'd expected it. "Mateo doesn't make careless moves. If he's here, it's because he wants us to know he's here." They barely slept that night. Gabriel patrolled the house several times, while Isabella stayed by the fire, clutching the blanket around her. Outside, the wind had picked up again, swallowing any sound that might have warned them of someone's approach. At dawn, Gabriel decided to follow Mateo's trail. He left Isabella with clear instructions and the promise to return before nightfall. But as the hours passed and the sky turned grey, he still hadn't come back. When the sun was sinking behind the pines, a noise at the door broke the silence. It wasn't the bolt turning. It was something or someone pushing gently, testing the resistance. Isabella stepped back, her breathing quickening. "Gabriel," she whispered, though she knew he wasn't there. The push came again, a little harder this time. Then a deep voice, almost a whisper, came from the other side of the wood. "You shouldn't be here, Isabella." The whisper at the door vanished as quickly as it had come. Isabella backed away, holding her breath, until the silence returned to wrap the house. She didn't open. She stayed by the fire, blanket tight around her, watching the lamplight flicker on the wall. Minutes passed, maybe hours, until at last she heard firm footsteps approaching along the path. The bolt turned, and Gabriel stepped inside, covered in snow. "What happened?" she asked at once. He studied her face before answering. "Nothing I didn't expect." He shook off his coat and set the rifle on the table. "Tomorrow we're going to the village." Isabella frowned. "Why?" "Valdez sent for me." He said nothing more, and she knew he wouldn't even if she pressed him. The rest of the night passed in thick silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Gabriel seemed lost in thought, sharpening his knife over and over as if he needed to keep his hands busy to avoid speaking his mind. The next morning, they set out before the sun was fully up. The village was covered in a thin layer of ice, the streets nearly empty. Gabriel left her at the blacksmith's, under the man's curious gaze, and headed alone to Valdez's house. "Don't leave here," he ordered before walking away. Isabella waited a while, feigning interest in the tools and the forge's fire, but every minute dragged, and she couldn't resist peeking out the window. She caught sight of Gabriel entering Valdez's large wooden building, the door closing behind him. She didn't know how long it was before she saw him come out. His stride was firm, but something had changed. His shoulders were stiffer, his gaze fixed on some faraway point. When he came to get her, he said nothing the entire way back. Once home, Gabriel shut himself in his room. Isabella heard him moving around, opening and closing drawers as if searching for something. Then silence. Curiosity burned in her. She waited until she heard him go out the back door and head toward the shed. She slipped quietly into his room. The smell of leather and smoke filled the air. On the table lay a pile of disordered papers. She sifted through them carefully until she found an envelope, folded several times, with the seal broken. She opened it. The letter was brief, written in Valdez's neat handwriting. "The deal still stands. Don't forget what you owe yourself, and what you owe me. She is the key. Don't lose sight of her." Isabella's heart jolted. She is the key. The phrase echoed like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. She refolded the letter and placed it exactly where it had been. She had barely enough time to leave the room before she heard Gabriel's footsteps approaching. He came in, glancing at her sideways. "Did you go into my room?" "No." The lie came too quickly, but he didn't seem inclined to challenge it. That night, Gabriel barely ate. He moved from corner to corner, checking locks, adjusting the lamp, as if expecting something, or someone. When he finally sat before the fire, he spoke without looking at her. "If you ever have to choose between staying here or leaving, don't trust anyone who says they come on Valdez's behalf." "Not even you?" she asked. Gabriel looked up. "Especially not me." The flames threw long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind drove snow against the wood, but beneath those sounds, Isabella thought she heard something else. A faint creak, footsteps on the ice. Gabriel heard it too. He took the rifle and doused the lamp. "Stay away from the windows." Darkness filled the room. The sound came again, closer this time. And then, a sharp knock on the door. "Mendoza!" The voice was clear, recognizable, and this time it did not belong to a messenger. "Come out and we'll talk like before." The blow against the door thundered like a drum in the frozen stillness of the night. "Mendoza!" The voice was firm, charged with something that did not sound like a plea. "Come out and let's talk like before." Don't make me wait. Gabriel did not answer. Leaning on the frame, rifle in hand, he stared at the wood as if he could see through it. The fire crackled, throwing sparks that carved his hardened profile in light and shadow. Isabella stepped closer. Who is it? None of your business. Maybe he wants to help you. Gabriel turned sharply, his gaze like a blade. I told you not to open that door. Outside the man spoke again, now closer. You can't hide her forever. You know they're going to find her. Gabriel's jaw tightened. He slammed the bolt shut and turned toward her. Go to your room. I'm not going to hide like I'm... I said go. She didn't move. Why did you bring me here, Gabriel? You didn't know me. You risked your life. Why? He held her gaze for a long moment before speaking. It wasn't to protect you. The silence was heavy. Then? It was to keep them from having you. The cold in his voice was sharper than the one outside. Who are they? People who know nothing of limits or mercy. The footsteps outside faded, sinking into the snow. The voice did not return, but the words lingered, like a shadow that would not lift. That night, Gabriel did not sleep. He kept watch by the window, the rifle resting on his knees. Isabella, from her room, heard the creak of the wood, the howl of the wind, and that thick silence that left no room for rest. In the days that followed, he limited his outings and forbade Isabella to cross the door. Not until I'm sure. The confinement drove her restless. She walked the house 100 times, noting every detail. A door in the hallway remained locked. She tried the handle, solid, pressed her ear against it but heard nothing. One afternoon, while Gabriel was in the shed, Isabella went into his room. Amid the smell of leather and smoke, she found an old map of the valley, with red marks in several places. One had a handwritten name, Black Hill, the same one he had murmured in his fevered delirium. Before she could examine it further, she heard his steps and quickly put everything back. Gabriel appeared, his coat damp with snow. What are you doing here? Just came to see if you needed anything. He didn't answer, but his look made it clear he didn't believe her. That night the wind was strong. A long howl drifted in from the forest. Gabriel stood, his back tensing. That's no wolf, he murmured. What is it? A signal. We're not alone in these mountains. He stepped closer to her, his eyes locked on hers. Listen closely. If I don't come back tomorrow, don't look for anyone in the village. Follow the stream north to the old mine. Why are you telling me this? Because soon I might not be able to stop them from finding you. The fire lit the steel glint in his eyes. Outside, the howl came again, closer, followed by the gallop of several horses approaching through the snow. The gallop shattered the frozen night silence, each strike of hooves on snow pounding like a war drum. Gabriel moved quickly. He doused the fire with a bucket of water, plunging the house into darkness. Moonlight, filtering through the cracks, drew long distorted shadows on the walls. Stay away from the windows, he ordered gravely. Isabella backed toward the table, where a loaded rifle rested. Her heart pounded in her throat. Gabriel checked the door bolt and took position at the narrow window that offered a view of the entry path. The hoofbeats stopped a few yards away. A heavy silence, as thick as the snow on the roof, spread. Then a hard knock rattled the door. Mendoza! A harsh voice, familiar to him. You know who I am and why I've come. Gabriel didn't answer. The next blow made the wood groan. Outside, another voice, younger, joined in. We'll get in anyway. The first shot shattered the window glass. Gabriel answered without hesitation, the muzzle flash lighting his tense face. Outside, shadows moved among the pines, and the horses neighed nervously. Isabella ducked instinctively, covering her head. Through the back, she heard clearly amid the shouts. Gabriel crossed the house to the kitchen, where another window faced the forest. Isabella followed, clutching the rifle with trembling hands. A dark figure appeared at the side. Without thinking, she pulled the trigger. The shot knocked the man back, and he let out a growl before disappearing into the snow. Gabriel glanced at her, surprised. Good. Don't leave my side. The assault intensified. 2 men tried to batter down the front door with a log as a ram. Gabriel fired through the wood, forcing them back. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the smoke mixed with the icy vapor seeping through the cracks. Amid the chaos, a different voice, closer than the rest, shouted, "Lucia, come out now and we won't hurt you." Isabella felt time stop. That name wasn't hers, but the tone in which it was spoken sent a chill down her spine. Gabriel turned toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What did they say?" "Nothing. I don't know them." His gaze hardened, but another shot against the doorframe forced him to turn back to cover. "To the attic. Quick," he ordered. They climbed the narrow stairs, the wooden floor creaking under their feet. From above they could see through a small opening outside. 3 men circling the house, another holding the horses, and one crouched near the shed. The snow, lit by the moon, revealed tense faces and steady hands on their weapons. Gabriel handed her a small pistol. "If anyone comes up, shoot without thinking." Isabella nodded, though her hands felt foreign to her. Minutes stretched into eternity. Outside, footsteps crunched on the snow, and now and then a blow echoed against the walls. Finally, a sharp whistle cut through the air. The men began to withdraw, their shadows stretching as they moved toward the forest. The hoofbeats faded, blending into the murmur of the wind. Gabriel waited still until he was sure no one remained nearby. He went down first, checked every corner of the house, then stepped out to the threshold, rifle ready. The footprints in the snow were deep and clear. They hadn't gone far, just enough to be out of sight. When he returned, his expression was not relief. "They won't stop," he said, shutting the door with a sharp bang. "And now I know you haven't told me the whole truth." Isabella looked at him, her breathing still quick. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he shot back, stepping closer. "They called you by another name, and you reacted." She opened her mouth to deny it, but no words came. The echo of that voice saying Lucia still rang in her head, tangled with blurry images she preferred not to recall. Outside, the wind hurled a swirl of snow against the window, as if to seal the conversation. Gabriel stepped back, but his voice was as sharp as a knife. "Tomorrow we leave here, and when we're far enough, you'll tell me who the hell you are." Morning broke grey, with thick fog crawling between the pines. Gabriel already had the saddlebags ready when Isabella came out of her room. There were no polite words, no shared breakfast, just a brief gesture toward the door. "We leave now." His voice was firm, leaving no room for discussion. The cold air bit at their skin as they moved along the snowy path. Gabriel walked ahead, scanning every shadow among the trees. Isabella, wrapped in the coat he'd given her that first night, kept her eyes down, trying to match his pace. The silence was so dense that the crunch of snow beneath their boots felt like forbidden noise. After hours of walking, the path grew steeper. The forest gave way to a rocky slope, and among the boulders appeared a dark wooden structure, almost hidden in the snow. An old cabin, smaller than the ranch, but sturdy. Gabriel opened the door with a rusty key. Inside smelled of old wood and stale smoke. He lit the fire in the hearth and set the weapons in a corner. "They won't find us here so easily," he said, though his eyes showed he wasn't entirely sure. Isabella set her bag on a bench and moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out to the heat. Gabriel watched her from the shadows, as if weighing every move she made. "Now," he began, "I want you to tell me who you are, and don't give me another false name." She swallowed hard. The flames cast an orange glow on her face, and for the first time since he'd found her, she chose not to hide. "My name is Lucia Herrera." Gabriel didn't react immediately. "That's the name they shouted the other night." "Yes, and if they did, it's because they've been looking for me since before the auction." She stepped away from the fire, as if the sudden heat was unbearable. "I wasn't born where I told you. My family lived on the other side of the Sierra, on an estate my father lost in a deal with Valdez. When he tried to get it back, he disappeared. My mother died soon after. I was alone, and I made the mistake of trusting the wrong person." Gabriel didn't take his eyes off her. "Mateo," Lucia nodded slowly. "He promised to take me far away, but delivered me to Valdez's men instead. They were going to sell me to settle a debt. I don't know why they didn't that night. I just remember being hit and waking up at the auction." The silence that followed was heavy. Gabriel stepped to the fire and for the first time sat across from her without keeping his usual distance. "Now I'll tell you something I didn't plan to." His voice was low, weighted with something old. "Elena was my wife, Lucia lowered her gaze. "The woman you spoke of in your fever." Gabriel nodded. "Valdez had her killed. She found out he dealt in more than cattle and land. She saw what she shouldn't have." His eyes hardened. "I got there too late that night. Far too late." Lucia felt a knot in her stomach. "That's why you took the deal with Valdez?" "Yes. I took it to stay alive long enough, to find the moment to destroy him." The flames crackled, filling the gaps in their conversation. Outside, the wind whistled through the mountain crevices. "And you," Gabriel went on, "why do they think you're the key?" "Because I'm not just the daughter of a man who owed him money." Lucia took a deep breath. "My father kept records of all Valdez's illegal dealings. I found them before he disappeared. I didn't get to read them all, but I know they contain names, dates, places, proof. I hid them before I fled." Gabriel's stare was fixed on her. "Where?" "In a place he won't dare look. The old ruined chapel near the North Pass." A gust of wind rattled the door, and both turned their heads at the same time. Gabriel stood, took the rifle, and went to the window. He saw nothing, but the snow bore fresh tracks, neither his nor Lucia's. "They've found us," he murmured. Lucia rose, her heart pounding. Gabriel returned to her side, rifle in hand, resolve on his face. "If they want those records, they'll have to make it to the chapel alive, and I intend to make sure they don't." At that moment, a creak on the roof made them go silent. The fire still burned, but the cold seeping through the walls no longer came from the mountain. It came from the danger surrounding them. The creak came again, slower this time, as if someone was walking carefully over the snow above. Gabriel signaled for Lucia to move away from the hearth and stand by the wall. The rifle was steady in his hands, his breathing measured, like a hunter waiting for the exact moment to strike. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the door. "Mendoza!" Valdez's deep, firm voice seeped through the cracks. "Open up! This ends today." Gabriel didn't reply. The wind carried another sound, several horses snorting, hooves on snow, and the clink of metal. They were surrounded. "Don't make us force our way in," Valdez added. "I didn't come alone, and you know I don't miss." Gabriel looked at Lucia. "When I open, go to the back. If you make it to the stream, follow it to the chapel. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. That's not an option." The door burst inward with a crash as a makeshift battering ram struck it. Wood splintered, and the mountain cold rushed in. Mateo was the first to cross the threshold, revolver in hand and a twisted grin. "Told you, old friend, I always finish what I start." Gabriel fired before he could get closer. The bullet grazed Mateo's shoulder, sending him stumbling with a cry of rage. Behind him, Valdez stepped inside slowly, as if untouched by the violence, his boots sinking into the snow that had blown in. "I didn't come for you, Gabriel," he said, glancing at Lucia. "I came for what she has." Lucia clenched her fists. "You'll never have it." Valdez smiled like a man humoring a naive child. "You don't understand, girl. Those records aren't just paper, they're power. And power always finds the one who deserves it." "Deserve?" Gabriel stepped forward. "Like when you deserved to have Elena killed." For a moment, Valdez's face lost its composure. She stepped where she shouldn't. Just like this one. The gunfire was almost simultaneous. Gabriel shot, but Valdez moved with unexpected speed, taking cover behind an armed man who fell to the floor. The cabin filled with smoke and metallic echoes. Remembering Gabriel's words, Lucia moved toward the back, but Mateo stepped in her way, his arm bleeding and his revolver aimed at her chest. "Not another step, Lucia. Or whatever your name is now." Their eyes met. She saw in Mateo's something more than hate, fear. "For you're afraid of what's in those papers," she said. "I'm afraid of what you do with them," he replied, tightening his grip on the trigger. Before he could fire, Gabriel slammed into him from the side. The three of them hit the floor. Mateo's gun slid out of reach. Valdez advanced toward Lucia, but she, driven by instinct, grabbed the rifle Gabriel had left and aimed straight at the man who had destroyed so many lives. "Give me one reason not to," she said, her voice trembling but steady. Valdez smiled. "Because if you kill me, you'll never know who else is on that list or what they did to your father." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind. Gabriel, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, got to his feet and stepped between them. Enough. Lucia didn't lower the weapon. You know more? She asked Gabriel, not taking her eyes off Valdez. I know that if you kill him now, everything we've done will mean nothing. We need him to talk, and I'll make sure he does. The tension stretched like a rope ready to snap. Finally, Lucia lowered the rifle, and Gabriel, in one swift motion, struck Valdez with the butt, knocking him unconscious. Mateo, wounded, tried to crawl toward the exit, but Gabriel stopped him with a shot to the leg. You're taking her to the chapel, he said, leaving no room for argument. And if you try anything, I won't need a second shot. The march to the chapel was slow and dangerous. Snow fell thicker, covering their tracks. When they finally arrived, the place was just as Lucia remembered: silent ruins, moss-covered walls, and a leaning wooden cross. Beneath one of the altar stones, she pulled out a small, rusted metal chest. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were the records: names, figures, routes, dates. Gabriel examined them silently. With this, he said, tucking them into his jacket, Valdez and everyone who follows him are finished. Lucia looked at him, knowing it wasn't truly over. And now? Now, he replied, scanning the white horizon. We decide whether to keep running, or make them all pay. A shot rang out in the distance, breaking the moment. Gabriel turned toward the forest, weapon raised. Someone else was out there, someone who hadn't yet shown themselves. Snow began to fall again, slowly covering the traces of all that had happened, as if the mountain itself meant to keep the secret of what was to come. The storm had passed. The mountain lay in deep silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire in the cabin's hearth. Outside, snow fell in slow flakes, as if the world wanted to blanket in white all they had lived. Lucia sat on the bench by the fire, hands extended to the warmth. Gabriel, standing by the window, watched the night. His silhouette, outlined by the flickering light, seemed more tired than ever, but also freer. They won't be coming, she said softly. You never know, he replied, though his tone lacked its usual hardness. Lucia looked at him. Something in his stance, in the way his shoulders had eased, told her that the war inside him was as close to ending as the one outside. Gabriel, she began, then stopped, as if afraid to break something fragile. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. He walked until he was only a step away. Tell me, all this time, I thought what you did for me was a debt to yourself, a way to get revenge. And maybe it was, but... She swallowed. I don't want us to owe each other anything anymore. Gabriel frowned, puzzled. What do you mean? That if we keep going, it's because we both choose it. Not out of fear, not because of the past. There was a long silence. Gabriel reached out and brushed aside a loose strand of hair from her face. I don't know if I can give you more than what I am now, he murmured. But what I am is yours. Lucia felt something in her chest give way. They weren't the perfect words a woman dreams of hearing, but in their rawness was a truth no empty promise could match. Then I don't need anything more, she replied. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes, and for a moment the whole world shrank to the warmth of that contact. There was no rush, no urgency, only the recognition that, after everything, they had found each other in the most unlikely place and still chosen to stay. When their lips finally touched, it was soft, as if either feared any sudden move might pull them back into reality. Outside, the snow kept falling, sealing that moment as a secret between them and the mountain. Gabriel pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held, feeling for the first time since it all began that she could close her eyes without fear. Beneath that frozen sky, they understood that their story neither began nor ended there. It merely changed shape, to be written together. Beneath the silent snow, Gabriel and Lucia understood that it wasn't the past that defined them, but the decision to stay together despite it. They had survived betrayal, danger, and truths that could have torn them apart, but they chose to remain, looking at each other as one who recognizes their true home in another's eyes. The mountain wind kept blowing, but it no longer carried threats, only the promise of a new beginning. And you? Do you believe that a love born in the middle of a storm can last forever? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know your opinion. If this story moved you, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell, because here we publish every day tales that touch the heart. Give it a like to support us and tell us where you're watching from. That way, we can keep sharing with you the best stories of love and life.